This is an extremely powerful way to automate the item attributes on weapons, and that will also automate the stat impacts they have. As you pass in new values for the durability variable, the item attributes will change on the item object, and when they do, all the stats that are affected by those attributes and objects will also be updated, all automatically at runtime. You don't have to do any of that yourself. Everything is handled automatically for you by game modules. In this video, we're going to deep dive into item objects and item attributes. Let's start by loading up the Game Modules window. Go to the Game Modules menu at the top and click on Game Modules Manager window. Let's dock this somewhere in our project. I'm going to make it a little bit wider as well. Let's start by creating some item objects. I'm going to click on the Item Objects button here. Now keep in mind, in this demo, I'm going to showcase some fancy weapons and other gear. In your project, item objects can be used for pretty much anything that can be equipped to the player, can be held by the player, can be picked up by the player. And you could also use item objects in more creative ways. So let's start by creating some basic weapons. All right, let's create some armor. Great, you can view these by clicking the arrow to select them in the inspector. And you can load these up to view them here in the inspector, or you can expand these to view the same information right here in the Game Modules window. The Game Modules window also has this helpful list view, which will give you access to some quick information and the ability to bulk edit the properties. Let's start with this quest item boolean here. This is an optional feature which signifies that this item is special. This is helpful in case there's an item that you don't want players to be able to throw away. If you're using the inventory, the drag and drop inventory system, the system won't let players drop an item that's a quest item, as that might be required to actually beat the game. So this is here for you to use it if you'd like to use it. If you're not using the inventory system, you might not need to make use of this, but you might want to make use of it for your own purposes in your project. We're going to come back to the item attribute tab, so let's go over to the stat effects tab. If you've seen the deep dive into stats and the deep dive into conditions, you'll probably recognize this view. Certainly check out the deep dive into stats to understand how stats are set up and how they are affected by other objects. So down here in the select section, we're going to find our damage and add that, and we're also going to find our attack and add that. So this is a weapon, and in this demo we're going to assume there's sort of like a XDY scenario where the player will be able to attack X times and do anywhere from 1 to Y damage for each attack, and that's going to help build the final attack value, the damage that they inflict onto an NPC or enemy. So let's go ahead and set this to be 3 for the damage and 2 for the attack, which means that each time the player attacks, they will do anywhere from 2 to 6 total damage before other considerations are taken into place, and assuming that there's no other attributes changing these values for the player. Let's hop over to the player, and you see that we have an actor here. This is actually a Game Modules Actor, and you can see that here in the script. The Game Modules Actor is a class which you can inherit from and create your own actor class, or you can just use it directly as we're doing right here in the demo. It has a plethora of methods and options that automate the game module's operation. You may notice that it also has 2 game item object lists, one for inventory items and the other for equipped items. We're going to make an assumption here that an item in the inventory does not affect the player's stats, while an item in the equipped items does. Whenever final stats are computed, the GetOtherLevels method, which is on GameModulesActor, is utilized to bring in all the different modification levels from the different things that might modify stats. So we can see here that we're going to add the conditions modification levels, quests modification levels, and equipped items modification levels. This is a virtual method, which means if you do create your own actor class which inherits from this, you can override this method and add additional computations here for the purposes of your game. For example, perhaps there are some global perks that the player has which provide an additional impact to stats regardless of what's equipped, what conditions they have, or what quests they have. You'd then be able to add that here and make it work for your game the way you want your game to work. You also have the option to add additional impacts to the stats listed here based on other stats that the player might have. For example, in some games, you might need the sword skill in order to even equip a sword item. However, perhaps in your game, the sword can be equipped by any character, but if they have the sword skill, they get an additional bonus. For example, if we add a 0.3 proficiency bonus to both damage and attack, the final damage added to the player will be 3 multiplied by 1.3, and attack will be 2 multiplied by 2.3, giving a final attack of 2.6 and a final damage of 3.9. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to stick with the base value changes for the weapons. If you're going to be setting up similar information for other objects, you can click this copy button here and then select another object, select the stat effects, and paste the modification list. It's a little easier than selecting the new stats, and then all you have to do is change your values. The Loot Items tab will show any Loot Items objects which contain this item object. Check out the deep dive video into loot and loot items to learn more about that. The Inventory tab is very optional. If you're using the drag and drop inventory system that ships with game modules, then you'll want to set your height and width of the object here. This refers to the amount of grid spaces that the object takes up in that visual drag and drop inventory. You'll also assign your inventory prefab and world prefab to these fields. If you're not using the drag and drop inventory system, then you can ignore these, or you can repurpose these values for your own system. And finally, we have the dictionaries. All game modules objects have dictionaries on them, and we can make use of that to add additional information and data to an object, which is extremely helpful when creating your own systems and making the game operate the way you really want it to operate. In order to add keys to the dictionary, we have to go down here to the types window and expand the dictionary structure. Here we can add keys that will be added to all objects of the same type. The individual data for each object can be different, but each object of the same type, in this case weapons, needs to have the same dictionary structure. We can see here I've added a flavor text key and an icon key, and they show up here in the Dictionaries tab where we can turn them on or off and add values to them. Every dictionary is able to have any number of values of these different types, including some basic types like int and float, game module types, and also other types like vector 2, 3, 4, colors, prefabs, and animation clips, etc. Let's add an item to the flavor text. And we have the option down here to show the string as a text box. So if we click that, then the string will appear a little bit larger, which might be easier to utilize when managing the data. I've installed some basic sprites here from another project. I just wanted to show what that looks like when you add a sprite to the sprite list. Check out the Dictionaries deep dive for more information. They're extremely flexible and give you a lot of options to expand the use of game modules for your game and store data as you need for your project. So let's hop over to the item attributes. In order to explain these, we need to start by creating some item attributes. So I'm going to go back to the game modules window here and click on item attributes. Item attributes are of course things that describe something, and they can also have an impact on stats. We're going to start by creating some attributes that might describe the weapons that we've just created. First, let's create some attributes that describe the rarity of objects. Great, I've put those as a type rarity. All game module objects have an object name, which is the name of the scriptable object, and an object type, which is the name of the folder that the scriptable object is in. To change the type, simply move the object from one folder to another. Alright, let's create some that describe the quality of the item. Great, now I'm going to create some additional attributes which might modify the stats based on magical properties or something like that. So these are all of fire, of ice, of something, and I'm going to make this type suffixes, and then let's create some prefixes as well. Excellent, this is a great way to describe these objects. Just like with item objects, the item attributes can be edited by selecting them and viewing them in the inspector, or expanding them and editing them in the Game Modules window. The Game Modules window does have the list view, which has some options which might make it a little bit easier to edit many objects all at the same time. So let's start by looking at the stat effects. This prefix is accurate, and so let's go ahead and look up our accuracy stat, and we're going to add that. And we're going to have an impact on the player's accuracy when they have an accurate weapon equipped or an accurate object equipped. In this case, let's add a base value of 3. And that means that if the player has an accurate sword equipped, then the player's accuracy will be increased by 3 for that duration. If they unequip the object, then the stat will be recomputed and they will lose that benefit. Let's hop over to the of fire attribute here and check out the stat effects. I wanted to show an example of how you can use game modules in different ways to build out more complex behaviors for your project. Not all projects have the same requirements, and game modules is intended to be extremely flexible so that you can make the game you want to create rather than be held back by the limitations of the system you're using. Let's add our damage and our fire magic skills here. So this might be a sword of fire or a staff of fire or something like that. I'm going to add 2 different things here. First, let's add 2 extra damage to anything that has of fire. And we're also going to add a 0.5 increase to the fire magic proficiency. This means that if the owner of the object, which has of fire attached to it, has the skill fire magic, that proficiency will go up by 0.5, and that equates to a roughly 5% increase in their final fire magic stat. How your game treats the fire magic stat is completely up to you. It might impact damage, it might impact other things, but this would increase the proficiency, and the proficiency increases the final stat value when the final stat is calculated. If the owner doesn't have the fire magic stat on their list, then this will have no impact. So first, I wanted to demonstrate how we can use fire magic in this other source. As you can see here, we can't have fire magic also affect fire magic, as that would create an infinite loop, but we can add an additional boost to the damage proficiency when the fire magic skill is learned. But we also have other options here as well. Instead of adding a 5% across the board proficiency boost, we can choose points here and add a 1% increase for every point the owner has in the fire magic skill. Again, what that means for your game is entirely up to you, but perhaps the points of that stat are something that the user can add to over time through leveling up or other mechanisms. And as those points increase, any object which has a fire attached to it will become even more valuable with even more damage to the actor who holds it. Now, in some projects, perhaps a weapon of fire means it's going to cause fire damage, and sometimes some enemies or NPCs might be strong or weak against fire damage. The algorithm you create that computes the final damage inflicted on NPCs might want to take into account that this is a weapon of fire. Since Game Modules is quite flexible, there are multiple ways to achieve this. One way is to use the dictionaries. So let's go over to our types here and expand the dictionary structure for suffix, and we're going to add damage type to all suffixes. Now you could add a string and type in fire to say it's fire damage here, or you could add a stat and choose fire magic to indicate that it's of type fire magic. In some projects, it might make sense to have one or the other. Now, this video won't get into the coding behind it, but now that we have this in our dictionaries, our damage algorithm can look for this entry, and if it exists, it might modify the final damage inflicted on an enemy based on whether it's strong or weak against fire magic. Another way to accomplish this is to add a fire damage stat. If we go back to our stats here, we can create a new stat called fire damage. We'll make sure this is set as modifiable, and then it's going to show up in our list here. If we add that, instead of damage, we can set this to be fire damage. Now in the algorithm we write for our combat mechanics, we can utilize this value in conjunction with the regular damage and handle that as we'd like. Perhaps your game separates regular damage from fire damage. Perhaps your game will recognize that fire damage exists, therefore do something about it. But I just wanted to demonstrate that there's a lot of different ways to accomplish common game mechanics that you might need for your game. If you don't need it, then do something different. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to undo that, and we're just going to stick with regular old damage here. Let's check out the settings panel. In our general settings, we have 3 options. The first two affect all of the attributes of the same type. The first one here is distinct. When this is true, it means that only one item attribute of this type can be inside a game items attribute list at any one time. So let's go ahead and set that true for suffixes, and you can see it's going to set that true for all of these. In fact, we're also going to set it true for prefixes and quality and rarity. Replace others goes along with the distinct option. When true, it means that when we attempt to add this item attribute to a game item attribute list, it will replace any others of the same type. When false, it means that if another item attribute of the same type already exists in the list, we won't be able to add this item attribute to the list. We can attempt to add it, but it just won't be added. The other item attribute will remain. We're going to leave both of those true for this. The third option here is affects actor. When true, the stat effects will affect the stats of the actor directly. When false, it's going to affect the stats of the item which holds the attribute, and then the item object will affect the stats of the actor. There's a slight difference in final impact. Generally speaking, if the stats affect the actor, they're going to have a larger impact. And we can kind of visualize and think about that when it comes to these quality options here. Let's go ahead and load up one of these options. I'm going to load damaged, and we're going to check out the stat effects here. Now for this demo, a damage item is going to be something that just might not be as powerful. So we've added our damage stat here, and I'm going to add a negative proficiency boost of 0.4, which implies a 40% reduction in damage. If we look at our settings here, right now this affects the actor. And that means that the damage of the entire actor will be reduced by about 40%. If there are other things that are affecting the actor's total damage, that total value will be reduced by 40%, even though it's only this one object that is damaged. Therefore, we can set affects actor false, and now this proficiency change will affect the object rather than the actor. This means the damage of our sword, instead of being 3, will be reduced by 40% and will end up being 1.8. That's a much different impact than if we reduce the entire damage of the whole player, the whole actor, by 40%, considering the actor might have other conditions and stat modifications which affect damage. How you choose to use this is completely up to you and your project. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to set all of the quality to be affecting the object, not the player. And we can hold shift down while selecting these to change all of the same type. I'm going to make the same change for the rarity options here. Now let's check out the name settings. We're looking at the accurate prefix here, and we have the option for human name and name order. Each item object will have a full name that includes information from the attributes attached to it. By default, attributes will not modify the name of the object because they're empty. As long as this is empty, then it will have no impact on the item object name. But if we have a sword with this attribute on it, we might want it to be listed as an accurate sword. So we can click the Use Name button to add accurate into that, or we can customize the name to be something different. We can also set the name order. I'm going to set this to be -1 because I want this to come before the name of the object. The name of the object will always be in order 0, and anything with a negative value will come first. Anything with a positive value comes later in numerical order from lowest to highest. If we hop over to our of fire, we can set the name order to be 1 and use name. Now if the sword has both accurate and of fire, the final name will be accurate sword of fire. For a rarity, I'm not going to change this at all, nor am I going to change the quality so that they don't have an impact on the final name of the object. Now let's look at the requisite attributes. There are two lists here that you can make use of. The required attributes are going to be added to any game item attribute list when this attribute is added to it as well. For example, we might choose the rare attribute to be added whenever the accurate attribute is added to an object. That means that an object that might otherwise be common, like just a sword, might be rare if it's an accurate sword. The note here reminds us that when rare is added, any other rarity attribute will be replaced. If we turn off the replace button here, we can see the note change specifying that now rare won't be added if any other rarity attribute is already present. And if we turn off the distinct option, then it simply shows rarity. And now any object with rarity can have multiple rarity settings, which in this context probably isn't intentional or ideal. You can add any number of attributes. However, if the attribute is marked as distinct, then you can only add one of each type. You can also specify incompatible attributes. When you attempt to add this item attribute to an item attribute list, if one of these incompatible attributes already exists, then this attribute will not be added. As an example, let's create a new prefix called flaming. If we select this, we might add the of ice as an incompatible attribute. That means that if we try to add the flaming prefix and it already had of ice, we wouldn't be able to add flaming. That way we avoid the situation where we have a flaming sword of ice, which might be counterintuitive and it might be something you want to avoid in your project. One thing to keep in mind is adding this incompatibility here does not automatically add it to of ice. So we'll want to select of ice and be sure to add the flaming attribute here so that they are both incompatible in both directions. Now let's hop back over to our item objects and let's select our sword. And we'll view this in the inspector and select the item attributes tab. And let's check out the allowed item attributes. And I'm going to expand both of these. Here you can see all the attribute types that we have in the project. And I'm going to toggle on all of these to indicate that this item, sword, is able to have attributes from all of these types. In the loot boxes module, attributes can be added automatically through a random dice roll, and this will allow you to specify which attributes can and cannot be used on a specific object. For example, maybe a sword can be common, epic, and rare, but maybe it can never be legendary. We wouldn't want legendary to ever be thrown onto it. For the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to copy all of these, and we'll leave legendary turned off. We can copy the sword, we can select another object, and paste the values here. Now let's look at our starting item attributes. The attributes you set here will be added to the item object whenever a new one is created in the project. Let's add the common attribute here. And this means that every time a game item object of the sword is created, the game item attribute list will have the game item attribute common added to it. This will be automatic. We don't have to do anything about it at this point. It's just going to be automated, whether it's created via the normal creation methods in your scripting or automatically through a system like the loot boxes. You can add any number of item attributes to this list, but keep in mind you won't be able to add multiple of the same type if that type is set as distinct. Now let's look at the variable options here. I'm going to add a variable called durability. You can see the name of the variable right here. This is going to be the variable that you can use if you're scripting this. Variables can be used to automatically add and change item attributes at runtime based on these values. So let's add the quality here, and you can see that we've set this to be broken, damaged, new, and used. This is in the wrong order, so I'm going to move this up here so that we have broken, damaged, used, and new. You can see that the values here are automatically set to be equal distance between these others from 0 to 1. New is highlighted. That's currently the item attribute that would be used based on the value of this slider. As we move this down, you can see the highlighted text change to be the different item attributes. This can be used in game. Perhaps every time your character swings their sword, the durability is reduced by 0.1. Always going to be a value between 0 and 1, but the actual value of this variable can be any number, including negative numbers. So we can set this to be negative 20 to 20. And then as we change this value down, the range value remains at 0 through 1. And the range value is what dictates which item attribute is active at any one time. Let's go ahead and set this to 0 to 1000. And perhaps in the game, every time the sword is used, we decrease the durability by 1. That means it can be swung, well, 750 times before it becomes broken. But we can also use the curve to modify this value as well. By default, the curve is linear. And this means that there really is no change from not using the curve at all. But the benefit of the curve means that we can change and augment the final range value in a non-linear fashion. And this gives us a whole lot of flexibility in order to modify when exactly these item attributes are used. With a curve that looks like this, the value needs to go down to around 500 for the weapon to be changed from new to used. This is an extremely powerful way to automate the item attributes on weapons, and that will also automate the stat impacts they have. As you pass in new values for the durability variable, the item attributes will change on the item object, and when they do, all the stats that are affected by those attributes and objects will also be updated, all automatically at runtime. You don't have to do any of that yourself. Everything is handled automatically for you by Game Modules. That's the end of the deep dive into the item objects and item attributes. Don't forget to check out infinitypbr.com. Click on the scripting docs to see our extensive documentation, where you can check out a whole lot more about items, including the item objects and item attributes, and check out some demo videos and code examples as well. If you have any questions, just come to the Discord, and I look forward to talking to you. Thanks.